There's a moment when power reveals its true face, not in the grand speeches or ceremonial displays, but in the cold calculation that happens behind closed doors. When a leader realizes that kindness alone won't secure their position, that mercy without strength is just weakness wearing a mask. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this better than anyone. He saw through the polite fiction that good intentions could govern the world. And what he discovered was a strategy so brutal, so precise, that it's been shaping empires for 5 centuries. Use cruelty quickly, then appear merciful. 7 words that changed political power forever. Not because they taught rulers to be monsters, but because they revealed something darker. That sometimes the most merciful act is the most terrible one. That sometimes saving 1,000 lives requires taking 10. And that the leader who refuses to dirty their hands often watches their kingdom burn in the name of moral purity. This isn't about celebrating brutality. This is about understanding the mathematics of power, the cold equation that every leader faces when the stakes are life and death. When being nice means watching everything you've built collapse. When mercy becomes cruelty in disguise. Because Machiavelli didn't invent these tactics. He simply had the courage to write down what every successful ruler already knew. Today we're diving into the most controversial strategy in political history. The one principle that separates amateur leaders from those who actually change the world. And by the end of this breakdown, you'll understand why this approach terrifies idealists and why it works. Not because it's evil, but because it's effective. Not because it creates monsters, but because it prevents chaos. The year was 1502. Italy was a battlefield of warring city-states, mercenary armies, and papal politics. Into this chaos stepped a young man named Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, ambitious, ruthless, and armed with his father's blessing to carve out his own kingdom. His target was the Romagna region, a territory that had descended into complete anarchy. Bandits roamed freely. Murder was commonplace. The rule of law had collapsed entirely. Borgia knew he needed to restore order, but he also knew that doing it himself would make him the villain. So he made a calculated choice. He appointed a Spanish lieutenant named Ramiro de Orco as his governor, a man known for his brutality, a man perfect for the dirty work ahead. And then Borgia stepped back and let Ramiro loose. What followed was a reign of terror, mass executions, public displays of violence, methods so gruesome that even Renaissance Italians were shocked. But it worked. The bandits fled or died. The murder rate plummeted. Order returned to Romagna. The region became stable for the first time in years. Mission accomplished, right? Not quite. Because now Borgia had a different problem. The people hated their brutal governor. They blamed him for the carnage, even though it had saved their lives. This is where Machiavelli's genius reveals itself. Borgia didn't defend his lieutenant. He didn't explain the necessity of the violence. Instead, he did something that stunned everyone. One morning, the people of Cesena woke to find Ramiro de Orco's body in the town square, cut in half. His entrails scattered across the cobblestones. A bloody spectacle that sent a clear message. The brutal governor was gone. Justice had been served. The effect was immediate and devastating. The people didn't mourn Ramiro. They celebrated. They praised Borgia for removing the tyrant. They thanked him for avenging their suffering. In a single stroke, Cesare had transformed from the architect of oppression into the deliverer of justice. He kept all the benefits of Ramiro's brutal pacification while washing his hands of the moral stain. The region remained stable, but now the people loved their ruler instead of fearing him. This wasn't random violence. This was surgical psychology. Borgia understood something that most leaders miss. People don't just want results. They want someone to blame for the cost of those results. And if you're smart, you make sure that someone isn't you. Machiavelli watched this unfold and saw something revolutionary. Not just a clever political maneuver, but a fundamental truth about human nature and power. He saw that effective leadership sometimes requires actions that would be immoral in ordinary circumstances. That the leader who refuses to be cruel when cruelty is necessary often creates far more suffering than the one who acts decisively. But here's what separates Machiavelli's philosophy from simple brutality. He wasn't advocating for random violence or sadistic pleasure. He was describing a precise instrument. Cruelty in his framework had to meet specific conditions. It had to be necessary for maintaining order. It had to be swift and decisive, not prolonged torture. It had to serve the greater good, not personal vendetta. And most importantly, it had to stop once its purpose was achieved. Think of it like surgery. No surgeon enjoys cutting into human flesh, but they do it because sometimes causing immediate pain prevents far greater suffering. The surgeon who refuses to operate because cutting is wrong watches their patient die from a disease that could have been cured. Machiavelli saw political leadership the same way. Sometimes, the most merciful thing a leader can do is something that looks merciless in the moment. This principle turns conventional morality upside down. We're taught that good leaders are always kind, always gentle, always fair. But Machiavelli asked a darker question. What happens when kindness enables injustice? When gentleness allows chaos to flourish? When fairness means treating criminals the same as victims? The leader who refuses to punish wrongdoers isn't being moral. They're being negligent. Consider the mathematics of violence. If a ruler executes 10 conspirators to prevent a civil war that would kill 10,000 innocents, is that cruelty or mercy? If they publicly destroy one corrupt official to deter 100 others from stealing from the people, are they being brutal or protective? Machiavelli forced leaders to think in these terms, to weigh immediate harm against long-term consequences, to choose the lesser evil when all choices involve evil. But the strategy goes deeper than just calculated violence. The genius lies in the psychological aftermath, the appearance of mercy that follows the necessary cruelty. This isn't hypocrisy. It's recognition of human psychology. People need to believe their leaders are fundamentally good, even when they witness them doing terrible things. They need a narrative that preserves their faith in justice while accepting the reality of power. The ruler who remains openly cruel after the crisis passes becomes a tyrant. But the ruler who shifts to mercy once order is restored becomes a wise and just leader. They give people permission to forget the ugly necessities of governance and focus on the benefits those necessities created: safety, prosperity, stability, the things that matter for daily life. This transformation from necessary cruelty to apparent mercy requires perfect timing. Act too early, and the lesson doesn't stick. The troublemakers return, and you have to repeat the cycle. Act too late, and you become known as a monster rather than a protector. The window is narrow, and missing it can destroy everything you've built. Machiavelli observed that most leaders fail because they can't make this transition. They either remain permanently brutal, creating resentment that eventually destroys them, or they never embrace necessary cruelty in the first place, allowing problems to fester until they become uncontrollable. The successful leader masters both phases. They can be terrible when the situation demands it, and merciful when mercy serves their purpose. This isn't about becoming a psychopath. It's about understanding that leadership exists in a different moral universe than private life. The person who can afford to turn the other cheek is someone whose decisions only affect themselves. But the leader whose choices determine whether thousands live or die can't afford such luxury. They must be prepared to bear the moral weight of actions that would destroy an ordinary person's soul. The strategy reveals something uncomfortable about human nature itself. We claim to value mercy and kindness above all else, but when chaos threatens our safety, when disorder disrupts our lives, we quickly discover our appetite for justice. And justice, in its rawest form, often looks indistinguishable from revenge. The crowd that demands peace through negotiation becomes the same crowd that cheers when the enemy is crushed. The citizens who preach forgiveness transform into bloodthirsty spectators when the corrupt official faces the executioner. Machiavelli didn't create this contradiction. He simply acknowledged it exists and showed leaders how to navigate it without drowning in hypocrisy. Look at how this plays out in modern contexts. The CEO who fires 100 employees to save 1,000 jobs gets called heartless, until the company thrives and those 1,000 workers keep their paychecks. Then the same decision gets reframed as tough but necessary leadership. The narrative changes not because the action changed, but because time revealed its wisdom. The leader who understood Machiavelli's principle planned for that narrative shift from the beginning. But timing isn't the only element that matters. The way you frame the cruelty determines whether people see you as a protector or a predator. When Borgia eliminated his brutal lieutenant, he didn't explain it as political necessity. He presented it as justice for the people suffering. The same action, but the story made all the difference. People didn't see a ruler protecting his reputation. They saw a king avenging their pain. This framing strategy works because it aligns with how humans process moral complexity. We can't handle leaders who exist in gray areas. We need them to be either heroes or villains. So the masterful leader gives people a way to see them as heroic even when they're doing villainous things. They provide the narrative that preserves everyone's sense of moral order while achieving the results that chaos demands. The psychological mechanism runs deeper than simple manipulation. It taps into our need for meaning in suffering. When people endure hardship without purpose, they become bitter and resentful. But when that same hardship serves a greater cause, when it leads to something better, they can bear almost anything. The leader who inflicts necessary pain while providing that larger meaning transforms victims into believers. Think about how parents understand this instinctively. The mother who lets her child suffer the consequences of bad choices isn't being cruel. She's being wise. The father who enforces painful discipline isn't enjoying his child's tears. He's preventing worse outcomes down the road. But if that same parent never shows love, never demonstrates that the harshness serves the child's well-being, they become an abuser instead of a guide. Political leadership operates on the same principle, just with higher stakes. The ruler who can be harsh when harshness prevents greater harm, then gentle when gentleness rebuilds trust, masters the art of sustainable power. They become the parent figure for an entire society, feared enough to maintain order, loved enough to inspire loyalty. Stalin understood the first half of this equation perfectly. His purges eliminated millions of potential threats and consolidated his control over the Soviet Union. The terror was swift, decisive, and brutally effective at preventing organized resistance. But Stalin never mastered the second phase. He remained permanently suspicious, permanently cruel. He never gave his people permission to love him, only to fear him. And that fear eventually became the foundation for his posthumous destruction. When Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes, he wasn't revealing new information. Everyone already knew about the gulags, the executions, the disappeared families. What Khrushchev provided was official permission to acknowledge what they'd always known. Permission to hate the dead dictator without consequences. Stalin's failure wasn't in being too cruel. It was in never learning when to stop. The Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping, demonstrated the opposite approach during the Tiananmen Square protests. The crackdown was swift and brutal, crushing the movement before it could spread nationwide. But afterward, Deng shifted focus to economic reforms that dramatically improved living standards for hundreds of millions of Chinese citizens. The harsh suppression became the foundation for unprecedented prosperity. The narrative shifted from political oppression to economic liberation. This isn't to justify either approach morally. It's to understand how power actually functions in the real world. Leaders who ignore these dynamics don't become more moral. They become ineffective. And ineffective leaders in crisis situations don't preserve moral purity. They create power vacuums that get filled by people with fewer scruples and less competence. The business world provides cleaner examples of the same principle. The startup founder who refuses to fire underperforming employees out of kindness often watches their company collapse, destroying jobs for everyone. The executive who makes harsh cuts during a recession preserves the organization for recovery. But the leader who makes those cuts then spends years celebrating their toughness becomes despised. The one who frames the cuts as sacrifice for survival, then focuses on rebuilding and growth, gets remembered as a turnaround artist. Modern political campaigns reveal how this strategy adapts to democratic contexts. Candidates who want to appear strong often emphasize their willingness to make hard choices, to stand up to enemies, to do what others won't. But they balance this with promises of healing, unity, and compassion. They sell themselves as warriors during the campaign, then transform into peacemakers once elected. The voters get the strength they crave and the mercy they need. The key insight Machiavelli provided wasn't that leaders should be cruel. It was that they should be complete, capable of the full range of human responses as circumstances demand. The leader who can only be kind becomes a victim of those who prey on kindness. The leader who can only be harsh becomes isolated and eventually overthrown. But the leader who masters both, who knows when each is appropriate, who can shift between them seamlessly, becomes something more dangerous than either extreme. They become indispensable. People fear losing them because they provide both security and hope. Enemies hesitate to challenge them because they've demonstrated both capability and restraint. Allies trust them because they've shown both strength and mercy. This isn't about being liked or feared. It's about being needed. The strategy works because it mirrors natural leadership patterns throughout human evolution. The tribal leader who could organize violence against external threats while maintaining internal cooperation had the best chance of group survival. The chief who was only peaceful got conquered. The one who was only warlike destroyed his own tribe through internal conflict. But the one who could be both, depending on circumstances, created lasting legacies. Human beings are wired to respond to this combination. We seek leaders who can protect us from danger and provide for our needs. Danger requires strength, often violent strength. Prosperity requires cooperation and trust. The leader who embodies both becomes a father figure for the entire group. Someone who can be terrible to enemies and generous to friends. Machiavelli's genius wasn't in discovering this pattern. It was in systematizing it, in providing a framework that leaders could consciously apply rather than stumbling into by accident. He gave political power technology, a repeatable process for maintaining authority across changing circumstances. But understanding the framework is different from mastering its execution. Because the moment you try to apply Machiavelli's strategy without genuine necessity, it backfires catastrophically. People can sense authentic leadership from performative brutality. They can distinguish between a leader who hates the harsh choices they must make and one who enjoys them. The difference isn't in the action itself, but in the energy behind it. The leader who takes pleasure in causing pain reveals something broken in their character. They've crossed from strategic necessity into sadistic indulgence, and once people see that transformation, they never unsee it. The fear shifts from respect to revulsion. The mercy that follows feels calculated rather than genuine. The entire psychological architecture collapses because the foundation was rotten. This is why so many leaders who attempt Machiavellian tactics fail spectacularly. They mistake cruelty for strength, brutality for decisiveness. They think the point is to be feared, so they manufacture reasons to inspire fear. They become cartoon villains instead of complex leaders. They miss the subtle truth that real power often looks boring from the outside. The master of this strategy doesn't announce their intentions. They don't threaten or posture. When the moment comes for harsh action, they move with surgical precision. No drama, no spectacle, just clean resolution. The punishment fits the crime exactly. No excess, no shortage, just enough force to solve the problem permanently without creating new ones. Watch how this plays out in organizational leadership. The CEO who must remove a toxic executive doesn't make it personal. They don't publicly humiliate or drag out the process. They document everything, build an airtight case, then execute the decision cleanly. One day the problem exists, the next day it's gone. No mess, no loose ends, no opportunity for martyrdom or revenge. But then comes the crucial pivot. The leader who stops at removal creates a vacuum. Others wonder if they're next, if anyone is safe, if the organization has become a place of fear rather than growth. So the skilled leader immediately shifts the narrative. They communicate the values that drove the decision. They reinforce their commitment to the team. They demonstrate through actions that the harsh choice served everyone's well-being. The timing of this transition determines everything. Move too fast, and people think you're weak or inconsistent. Take too long, and the fear calcifies into permanent culture. There's a narrow window where people are ready to move forward, where they want to believe in something better than conflict. The masterful leader feels for that moment like a musician listening for the right note. Corporate restructuring reveals these dynamics constantly. Companies that announce layoffs execute them efficiently, then immediately focus on supporting remaining employees often emerge stronger. But companies that drag out the process, make multiple rounds of cuts, or fail to invest in survivors create lasting trauma. The difference isn't in the economic necessity of the cuts, but in how the leadership manages the psychological aftermath. The same pattern appears in military leadership. Generals who must make terrible tactical decisions, who sacrifice some units to save others, who order actions that guarantee casualties, face the ultimate test of this principle. The ones who compartmentalize the horror while maintaining their humanity become legends. The ones who either break from guilt or embrace callousness become cautionary tales. Consider how battlefield commanders throughout history have navigated these impossible choices. They send young soldiers into situations where death is probable, knowing that hesitation will cause even more deaths. In that moment, mercy becomes cruelty disguised. The general who cannot give the hard order watches his entire army get destroyed by indecision. But the general who gives the order then spends the rest of the battle thinking about something else, becomes a monster. The balanced leader feels the weight completely, gives the necessary order, then dedicates themselves to minimizing additional suffering. They visit the wounded, write letters to families, honor the sacrifice publicly. They carry the guilt so their soldiers can carry the mission. They absorb the moral complexity so others can focus on execution. This emotional labor is invisible but essential. The leader who cannot process their own moral contradictions becomes unstable. They either crack under the pressure or harden into something inhuman. But the leader who can hold both the necessity and the tragedy of their choices becomes someone others can follow into hell itself. The strategy reveals something profound about moral courage. We think of courage as always doing the right thing, but real leadership courage is more complex. It's doing the necessary thing while maintaining your humanity. It's accepting responsibility for outcomes you cannot fully control. It's bearing the weight of choices that will be misunderstood by people who never face similar stakes. This kind of leadership requires emotional intelligence that goes beyond normal human relationships. You must understand not just your own psychology, but the collective psychology of everyone you lead. You must predict how groups will react to your decisions, how narratives will evolve, how trust can be rebuilt after necessary betrayals. The leader who masters this becomes almost supernatural in their effectiveness. They seem to know exactly when to be hard and when to be soft, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to explain themselves and when to let actions speak alone. From the outside, it looks like intuition or natural talent. From the inside, it's a systematic understanding of human nature applied with scientific precision. But this mastery comes at a cost that few people can bear. You must live with contradictions that would destroy most personalities. You must maintain relationships with people while sometimes acting against their immediate interests. You must care deeply about outcomes while remaining emotionally detached from methods. You must be simultaneously empathetic and ruthless. The psychological strain explains why so few leaders sustain this approach long term. Most either burn out from the emotional complexity or simplify their worldview to cope with the stress. They retreat into pure ideology, either becoming permanently harsh or permanently soft. The rare few who maintain the balance become historic figures, remembered not for their kindness or cruelty, but for their results. Modern democracy attempts to solve this dilemma by distributing the moral burden across institutions. No single person bears complete responsibility for harsh choices. Congress declares war. Generals plan battles. Soldiers execute orders. Courts sentence criminals. Wardens oversee executions. Society benefits from deterrence. The system diffuses accountability so no individual carries the full psychological weight. But this diffusion creates its own problems. When everyone is responsible, no one is responsible. When harsh choices get filtered through committees and bureaucracies, they often become either ineffective or excessive. The surgical precision that Machiavelli advocated gets lost in institutional processes designed to protect individual consciences rather than optimize outcomes. The leader who understands this dynamic learns to work within democratic systems while maintaining personal accountability. They build coalitions for necessary but unpopular decisions. They take public responsibility for outcomes while sharing credit for successes. They use institutional processes to legitimize tough choices while maintaining the personal authority to implement them effectively. This requires a different kind of political skill than pure Machiavellian manipulation. Democratic leaders must persuade rather than command, build consensus rather than impose will. But the underlying psychological principles remain constant. People still need to believe their leaders can protect them from danger while providing hope for something better. They still respond to strength demonstrated through restraint rather than excess. The most successful democratic leaders master this balance by becoming storytellers as much as decision makers. They frame harsh necessities within larger narratives of progress and protection. They help people understand not just what is happening, but why it serves their deeper interests. They transform policy debates into moral narratives where difficult choices become heroic sacrifices. Think about how wartime presidents navigate these challenges. They must mobilize populations for sacrifice while maintaining democratic legitimacy. They cannot simply order compliance like autocrats, but they also cannot govern through endless debate when time is critical. So they use democratic rhetoric to build support for essentially authoritarian decisions. They ask for consent while preparing to act regardless of the response. The skill lies in making people feel they are choosing to support harsh measures rather than having them imposed. The leader presents the situation, outlines the options, demonstrates the consequences of inaction, then steps back and lets democratic pressure build toward the necessary conclusion. They orchestrate the decision without appearing to manipulate it. This democratic application of Machiavellian principles requires even greater sophistication than traditional autocracy. The autocrat can simply act and deal with consequences later. The democratic leader must build legitimacy for action before, during, and after implementation. They must maintain the fiction of popular consent while exercising essentially monarchical power. So there it is, the strategy that built empires and toppled kingdoms, the cold mathematics of power that most leaders refuse to acknowledge, let alone master. Use cruelty quickly, then appear merciful. 7 words that separate amateur leadership from the kind that changes history. You've seen how it works. The surgical precision of necessary harshness, followed by the calculated grace of apparent mercy. Not because it's moral or immoral, but because it's effective. Because sometimes the most merciful thing you can do looks merciless in the moment. Because the leader who refuses to dirty their hands often watches everything they built collapse in the name of staying clean. This isn't about becoming a monster. It's about understanding that real leadership exists in a moral universe most people never have to navigate, where every choice involves sacrifice, where kindness can become cruelty in disguise, where the mathematics of power demand calculations that would destroy an ordinary conscience. The world will always need leaders who can bear this weight, who can make the impossible choices while maintaining their humanity, who can be terrible when necessity demands it, and merciful when mercy serves the greater good. The question isn't whether you'll face these moments. The question is whether you'll be ready when they come.